Hi, it's Corrine, and today I'm making a keepsake book for my father, and I plan on putting some photos in there along with some cards. I'm using medium weight chipboard for the front and back cover, and the chipboard I cut at 7 by 7 3/4. I'm also using for my spine some grunge board by Tim Holtz. And the grunge board, I believe, comes in 8 by 4.5. And I cut mine at 8 by 4 1/4. I'm using some of his hinges there as well. That little piece that you see is going to be a hinge to keep my book closed. The other two long hinges are just for decoration. I also use some Tim Holtz Paper Stash craft resist paper, and I'm using some walnut ink by Sukaneko and some vintage photo distress ink to darken it up just a little bit. The front cover, I decided I wanted to make it a little bit lighter than the back cover, so I'm starting with the vintage photo, and I'm just going to lightly go around the entire paper, not worrying too much about the corners because I know that I'll be cutting those off. I will put a little bit of walnut ink on it as well. So I set my papers aside to dry, and now I'm putting a layer of the vintage photo on the spine, which is the grunge board. And it doesn't do much, but it does give it an extra layer on it, and that's what I wanted. I wanted a little bit of dimension on it. I'm doing the same with the hinges, but I did not want the hinges to be the exact same color as my spine. So I do a little bit of vintage photo on it, and then I also go over it with some black soot distress ink. And after I hit that with my heat gun, I take a nail buffer to file some of that off and give it a little bit more of a distressed look. I wanted to get the back side of that as well because you will see it. So now I'm using some distress paint, walnut stain, and I'm going to go over both sides of it, the front and the back, because again, you will be able to see the back a little bit. Although I'm not too worried about the color, I just did not want it to be plain. Then I'm also using some walnut ink to, again, give it a little bit more dimension and darken it up a little. And I'm just using a paintbrush to smooth that around. Here I'm making a box for the inside of my book, and that is the box that will hold the photos. I cut that paper at its craft cardstock at 8.5 by 9.5, and I scored at 7/8 of an inch on all four sides. That's the line right before the 1 inch mark. So here I'm just cutting opposite sides to give myself some tabs to form the box, and I'm cutting out a little bit of a V on them so it folds a little bit nicer and there's not as much bulk in the corners. But what I decided to do here before I actually form it into a box is I wanted to double the cardstock. I wanted to make it a little bit stronger. So I get another piece of the craft cardstock and I just kind of measure it out to the same length, and then I'm cutting it to, I believe, 2 inches, and I'm going to score it at, again, 7/8 of an inch. That way it lines up with the box and folds around the bottom of the box. Again, just to give it a little bit more stability. What you don't see here is off camera, or I should say it was on camera, but my battery had died and I didn't realize it, is I did end up putting the same chipboard that I used for the front and back cover. I put on the inside of this box, followed it all around the inside of the box because I wasn't real happy with the box. It was a little bit bowed out. It wasn't perfectly square, or it wasn't a perfect rectangle, I should say. So once I added the chipboard on the inside, it it held it perfect because I plan on putting a lot of photos in there. So I'm showing you I'm doing both sides here, but just so you don't have to sit through and watch, I I off camera did all four sides, but here I'm just showing you two sides, but I did do all four sides the same. And I know I'm a little bit out of frame there, but I had to get it close to my face in order to make sure that it was even. And my camera was a little bit off this time. I think I had it zoomed in just a hair too much. So I know a little of the um, footage is a little bit towards the bottom or a little out of frame, but I think most of the book you can see how I'm making. I tried to keep it in frame enough, so I hope you can see that. So now I'm just putting the tabs down with some hot glue. And here's the front and back cover. I cut those down to 7 3/4 by 8 1/2, and I also cut some craft cardstock for the inside matting and distressed them with vintage photo. And the craft paper I cut by 6 3/4 and 7 1/2. And I'm just adding tape around all four sides of the paper and the chipboard so I can adhere the paper or the paper to the chipboard. I'm not worrying about getting all the way to the corners on the paper because I plan on cutting those off to miter the corners. That piece of tape stuck, so I just put it up there if you're wondering why there's a small piece of tape up there. So now I'm going to add some Scotch Quick Dry to the middle of the chipboard because I want my paper fully adhered down. I do the exact same way when I make mini albums. This is how I do my front and back cover as well, and just wrap my design paper around it. I'm using my brayer to make sure that I have it adhered down real well. And same process with the back cover, adhering my chipboard down to it. Excuse me, that's my front cover. And now I'm just using my bone folder to score around all the chipboard, and I will start bending the paper in order to make it a little bit easier when I'm ready to remove the backing on the tape and adhere it down. Here's where I will miter the corners, and there I'm showing you that I did not cut all the way up until the chipboard. I left about 1/8 of an inch. You want to leave a little bit of the paper so it covers over the chipboard. So I'm going to do the same on the back side as well. So now I always start with my long sides and adhere those down. And with my bone folder, I'm tucking in the corners before I fold the paper down, and that way it gives it a perfect edge. Using my bone folder to just make sure it's all adhered down real well. And I also use my bone folder around all four sides of the outside of the chipboard just to make sure it's has nice clean edges. So now I'll tuck those corners in again before folding them over. Otherwise they tend to bulk out a little or stick out a little. So after I adhere that all down, I'll show you the corner there, how nice of a corner you get, and you don't see any chipboard on it. So now I'm going to add my hardware. I'm using a Tim Holtz hinge, I believe it is, and that will be on the front of the book. I will use my center ruler, centering ruler, I guess it's called, and find the middle of the book and mark it. And then I'll use my big bite to place a hole in it, and then also use that as my guide to place a hole in the back cover as well for the back of the hinge to sit in. And I'm doing all this before adding my matting on the inside. That way it hides the hardware. You don't see that. And here I do go out of frame a little bit because I'm screwing in that hinge. I'm trying to show you there on camera what I'm doing, but in order for me to get a really tight turn on it, I had to pull it close to me. So now the back, I'm going to be using a brad to adhere the back of that little, that's a bookmark plate, excuse me, but I'm using that as my hinge since it was the perfect size. Here I'm using a little E6000 to put underneath it before I place the brad in, and I will also use a little bit of hot glue as well so it holds immediately while the E6000 is drying. And I hammered that brad down just to make sure it was nice and tight. So now that my hardware is in place, I will add my tape to the back of the craft paper and then place that down, and that way you do not see the back of the brad or the back of that hinge on the front cover. Same process for the front and the back cover. I add the Scotch Quick Dry to it. Where I got this idea is my sister asked me to make something custom for her niece for Christmas, and the little girl just moved to a new state. She's 12 years old, and she said she's not very frilly. Um, so and her hobby is reading. She loves books, loves to read. So I decided to come up with a fake book, and on the inside I did the exact same thing, made a little box like I did here, but hers I added an accordion mini album to it, and it serves as a journal and also a list of all the books she's read, books she'd like to read, her favorite books, her favorite authors. So it's a little bit of a diary and a journal. And when I was done making that and I saw this Tim Holtz paper and I thought this would be perfect, I thought it would be a good gift for my dad. He lost his mom, my grandmother, about a year ago, and then last week he lost my grandmother's brother, which is my dad's favorite uncle. So I printed out some special pictures that I know my dad doesn't have, and I'm adding those photos along with some cards. And I also found some pay stubs from my father from like 1965, I think, or late 60s. So I'm adding those in there. I don't even think he has seen those in years and years. I don't even know if he knows that I have them. So I think he'll find this, as a good sentimental keepsake to keep on his dresser, or at least I'm hoping. So here I'm just centering out the hinges and marking those so I can add my brads to them to hold them down for the spine. Again, using my big bite. These just serve as decoration. So now I will just adhere the front and back cover to the spine, the piece of grunge board, and I'm just sort of measuring that out. I will use my T-square ruler in order to get a straight line, and I'll use that as my guide to make sure that they're straight on the grunge board. I'm just trying to make sure that I'm happy with the placement on it before I mark it. So now in order to adhere it, I'm going to use E6000 again and also a little bit of hot glue. The E6000 I let dry overnight, and the hot glue adheres it pretty much immediately, again giving the E6000 a chance to dry, but I didn't want it moving around. I didn't want to accidentally bump it or move it around, so that's why I added the hot glue. You want to be really careful when working with E6000. I did not open my craft room door, and I didn't have my ceiling fan on or anything, and I ended up with a little bit of a headache. So you want to be careful. The fumes are pretty strong, but you don't have to worry about this ever coming apart with E6000. So I'm doing the exact same thing to the back, and I will place some heavy books on them and let them sit overnight and let it fully dry before I work with it again. I also, you'll see, made a or used a book plate by Tim Holtz and put the word dad in it, and I filled it with glossy accents, and I let that sit overnight as well. I didn't do that on camera. So here's the finished book after it sat overnight and it's completely dry. And as you can see, that you can't see the chipboard on the inside of the book, but it really, as you can see, it makes it perfectly straight and really holds those sides up well. So here's the book plate or frame that I was referring to that I let sit overnight with some glossy accents in it. Again, I'll use some E6000 and hot glue to adhere that down. This time I made sure to have my craft room door open. So I'll set that aside to dry, and I use the same craft paper, Paper Stash by Tim Holtz Paper, to cut out a library pocket and a library card that says date issued, I believe, and this is what I'll use to write a note to my dad. I'm going to put this in the front of the book. I'm using some vintage photo to distress it on the edges there. I'm just using some Scotch Quick Dry to adhere that down. And then I decided I wanted to add something to the library pocket without um, using anything feminine. So I used a token, I believe they are, by Tim Holtz. It says Excellence. And I grabbed some baker's twine that I'm going to wrap around and tie it on there. And then I'll adhere that to the front of the book, of the inside cover. So that is pretty much it. I hope you enjoyed the process, and if you have any questions about anything I used, please leave me a comment. And thanks for stopping by. Happy holidays to everyone.